As our body cells carry out our normal metabolic activities, they consume oxygen and nutrients, but in the process of doing so and using that oxygen and nutrients, cells produce waste products like carbon dioxide that we talked about with the respiratory system, but also urea and uric acid, nitrogenous waste. So these waste products have to be eliminated from the body because if they accumulate, they can become toxic to body cells. So again, the respiratory system gets rid of CO2 when we exhale. But the urinary system has to get rid of almost all of our other waste products by filtering them out of the blood and then excreting them into the urine. So disposal of those waste products in the urine is an important function of the urinary system, but it's not the only function. The urinary system, because it filters the blood, can regulate the composition, the pH, the volume, and the pressure of the blood, can help to maintain the osmolarity of the blood, and also secretes hormones. Think for a moment what hormones that you've already learned about in the endocrine system, and also when you talked about the blood that came from the kidneys. Just a little teaser there. We'll continue to talk about it. So before we begin, let's look at the major components that make up the urinary system. So here we have a male view and a female. Both are going to have right and left kidneys. The kidneys are going to filter the blood and create the waste product that we call urine. That urine is then going to travel from the kidneys through two tubular structures, again, male and female. Those tubes are called ureters. The ureters are going to fill the urinary bladder. Here you have the urinary bladder in the male. And the bladder is going to be emptied by another tubular structure called the urethra. So in the male, the urethra exits the bladder, runs through the prostate gland, through the shaft of the penis, through the glans penis, and to the external urethral orifice, the opening. In the female, the urinary bladder is also going to be drained by the urethra, but it's a very much shorter tubular structure that opens anterior to the vaginal canal. I always bring up when I'm talking about this in my lab the fact that many of our elderly women don't know that there are 3 openings in the female body. When my mother was terminal with her cancer back many years ago, they had to, when she became bedridden, they put a catheter in her, and she actually thought it was in her vagina, that she urinated from her vagina. So help me stomp out ignorance, folks. Let's teach people. Yes, there are 3 openings in the female. I wanted to also include a sagittal section here so that you could see the lateral view of these organs as well. Now, the kidneys are not shown in this because I wanted to be sure that you could also understand the role and the position of the other organs. So the kidneys are going to be located in the retroperitoneal space, which means that they're behind the peritoneum. Again, we'll see this in just a moment. Here you can see this image begins with the ureters. So the kidneys have already done their job, which is to filter the blood. The ureters run from each kidney down to the urinary bladder. So here in the female, you can see the urinary bladder is anterior and inferior to the uterus. So this is the uterus. There's the vaginal canal. Here you have the rectum and the anus. Here's the urinary bladder being emptied by the urethra. So again, it illustrates the point I made just a few seconds ago. 1, 2, and 3. In the male, the ureters are going to fill the urinary bladder. Here you have the rectum and the anus. The urinary bladder is going to be drained by the urethra, which runs through the prostate gland and then through the penis, where the urine will exit through the urethra. Now you'll learn when we study the reproductive system that in the male, the urethra has 2 functions, and that is not only the excretion of urine, but also the same tube that's used for ejaculation. So as we begin looking at what this urinary system is all about, let's begin with the function of the kidneys. So by forming urine, the kidneys help to excrete waste products from the body. Some of the waste products that are going to be excreted in the urine result from metabolic reactions. A lot of these are nitrogenous waste, which mean they contain nitrogen, such as urea, uric acid, and ammonia. So they're going to be excreted in the urine. But there are other waste products as well, such as foreign substances that have entered the body, such as drugs or environmental toxins. The kidneys help regulate the blood level of several different ions. Some of the main ones include sodium and potassium. Oh, you've learned about those already, right? When we talked about aldosterone and atrial natriuretic peptide. Calcium, chloride ions, and phosphate ions. So the kidneys regulate these by adjusting the amounts of these ions that are either retained in the body or excreted in the urine. The kidneys can excrete hydrogen ions as well in the urine and conserve bicarbonate ions. So these bicarbonate ions are buffers that buffer the hydrogen ions and help to prevent major changes in pH. The kidneys adjust blood volume. Again, we've seen this with the endocrine system by either retaining and allowing for reabsorption of water or eliminating more water in the urine. So an increase in blood volume, remember, increases blood pressure. A decrease in blood volume decreases blood pressure. So by retaining or excreting more fluid, more water, we're altering blood pressure. Now, if you also remember when you talked about the endocrine system, or when we learned about the endocrine system, the kidneys secreted renin. Remember the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone pathway? What started all of that? The kidneys detected low blood pressure and released renin, which caused that whole conversion of angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1 and angiotensin 2 that then stimulated the adrenals to release aldosterone. And then what happened? The little filter units that we're going to learn about in this chapter started increasing the amount of sodium that was retained in the body. When sodium is retained, water is going to be retained. That increases blood volume and increases blood pressure. So the kidneys can also help to regulate the loss of water and the loss of other and solutes that are in the urine. And by doing so, they help to maintain sort of a constant osmolarity. So what the heck is osmolarity? It's simply a measure of the total number of dissolved particles in a solution. So the particles can be ions or molecules or both. Doesn't really matter. It's just how much of it is there. The kidneys produce hormones. So we talked about calcitriol. The calcitriol is the active form of vitamin D. So we talked about this a little bit with bone in Anatomy 1. And calcitriol helps us to regulate calcium homeostasis. So without vitamin D, we can't absorb enough calcium as our food products are going to pass through the digestive system. So again, this one you were reminded of when we did the digestive system. But the kidneys are also going to produce erythropoietin. And erythropoietin stimulates the production of red blood cells. So it's going to be released when blood oxygen levels are decreased. It travels to the bone marrow, and then of course the bone marrow is stimulated to make more erythrocytes, which can carry more oxygen on the hemoglobin. And like the liver, the kidneys can use amino acids in gluconeogenesis, or making of new glucose molecules. They can also release glucose into the blood and help maintain normal blood glucose levels. And as you learned when we talked about diabetes mellitus, the kidneys are also going to excrete glucose in diabetes, because that glucose can't be absorbed into the cells without insulin. Before we really start examining the physiology of the kidneys, let's look just a little bit at the anatomy. So you have two kidneys, a left and a right. They're somewhat red in their color and look like great big kidney beans. They're located just above the waist between the peritoneum and the posterior wall of the abdomen. Now remember, the peritoneum is the serous membrane that lines the abdomen. Because of where they're positioned, posterior to the peritoneum, the organs are called retroperitoneal. They're located between the last thoracic and third lumbar vertebrae, so they're partially protected by your number 11 and 12 ribs. If you have a fracture to those lower ribs, they can very easily puncture the kidneys and cause very severe and even life-threatening damage. The right kidney is a little bit lower than the left because the kidney occupies a lot of space, because the liver occupies a lot of space there on the right side above the kidneys. So your kidneys are about the size of a bar of soap. Medial to the border of each kidney, or the medial aspect of each kidney, is going to be near the vertebral column. Near the center of that medial aspect, there's a concave area that forms an indention called the renal hilum. And it's through that renal hilum that the ureter is going to emerge from the kidney, and also the blood vessels, the renal arteries, the renal veins, the lymphatic vessels, and the nerves associated with the kidneys as well. There are three layers of connective tissue surrounding each of the kidneys. The deepest layer is what we call the renal capsule. So it's made up of a lot of dense, irregular connective tissue that forms also the outer part of the ureter. So it surrounds the kidney itself and the ureter. So it's tough tissue. It serves as a barrier against trauma or blows, and just basically helps to maintain the shape of the kidney. The middle layer is fatty tissue, adipose tissue. So it surrounds the renal capsule. It too protects the kidney from trauma, but also helps to hold it in place within the abdominal cavity. And the most superficial layer is called the renal fascia. And it's a thin layer of connective tissue that anchors the kidney to all of the surrounding structures in the abdominal wall. Now, even though we have all these layers of connective tissue and adipose tissue holding the kidneys in place, sometimes they do get displaced or sort of drop a bit. So this is sometimes called floating kidney, but the medical name for it is nephroptosis. So it can occur when the kidney just slips out of its normal position because it's not being held securely in place by the organs around it or the adipose tissue that covers it. So nephroptosis can develop in very, very thin people who have very little adipose tissue, or in people that have a deficiency of the renal fascia. This can be dangerous because when the kidneys drop, remember the ureters are long tubular structures that connect the kidneys to the bladder, right? Draining the kidneys. So when the kidneys drop, this can cause that long skinny tube, the ureters, to kink and curve, and sometimes that can block the flow of urine. When that urine backs up, can't be drained, it's going to put excess pressure on the kidney and can damage all of those soft tissues within it. This also usually causes a lot of pain as well. It is pretty common. About 1 in 4 people have some degree of weakening of all those fibrous tissues that hold the kidney in place, but it's 10 times more common in females than males. The internal kidney anatomy has an outer layer called a cortex and a middle layer called the medulla. So this should look very familiar to you when you learn the brain. The outer part of the brain was the cortex, the inner part was the medulla. So same idea here. So the cortex is this outer layer, and the renal medulla is the innermost layer that you see here. Now, your renal medulla is divided into little pyramid-shaped structures, so very much sort of like a triangle, but you also notice that it looks like the pyramids are divided by columns. Those are columns of the cortex, so they extend down into the medulla and help to form these little triangular shapes called the pyramids. The pyramids come to a point known as the papillae. So papillae is the point, and the papillae sit in little cup-like structures called minor calyces. That's plural for calyx. So each pyramid comes to a point called the papillae. The papillae sits in a minor calyx. Your minor calyces merge to form a major calyx. So here in this image you can see there's a minor calyx, a minor calyx, and a minor calyx, all merging to form a major calyx. Now all of your major calyces will merge to form an area that is enlarged. This is your this is your renal pelvis. Your renal pelvis then exits the kidney at the hilum, the indented area, and becomes the ureter. Remember, the ureter is going to collect that filtrate, which is now becoming urine, or has now become urine, and then fill the urinary bladder. The kidneys have about 1 million microscopic structures per kidney. Those microscopic structures, try saying that 4 or 5 times, are the filtering units, and they're called nephrons. So the filtrate is formed by the nephrons, and then they drain into a series of ducts that extend down through the renal papillae of the pyramids. So as the nephrons drain, or as the nephrons filter, they then drain into let me get my train of thought back here. As the nephrons filter the blood, that filtrate is now in the nephron, and it moves from the nephron into a collecting duct. Now your collecting ducts have several nephrons feeding into them. The collecting duct collects the filtrate. Then from that collecting duct, the fluid is going to flow into a papillary duct. Now, there are many collecting ducts that merge together to empty into the papillary ducts. And your papillary ducts are going to run through the renal papillae and empty into the minor calyx, and then the major calyces. All right, so each kidney has about 8 to 20 minor calyces and 3 to 4 major calyces. So each minor calyx receives the filtrate from the papillary ducts and delivers it into the minor calyx and then the major calyx. So once the filtrate enters the calyces, it becomes urine, because once it's there, we can't get anything back out of it. We can't reabsorb anything, so it is becoming the waste product. And again, your major calyces then are going to drain into that large cavity called the renal pelvis, and then that urine is going to pass through the ureter to the urinary bladder. And I just noticed there's a 5 at the end of urethra. Don't ask me why that's there. I didn't notice it, or I would have already gotten rid of it. The urinary bladder, of course, is going to be drained by the urethra, not the urethra 5.